Welcome back to our journey of a lifetime. We're going to be in lesson 17, looking at three books in books of wisdom or poetry. We've done Job and Psalms, and tonight we'll be doing the final three books in one lesson. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon are also called the Song of Songs. As it says there at the top of page 73, to understand the book of Proverbs, you need to use the book naming principle studied on page 6, and that basically is the principle that often the name of the book simply describes the contents. So proverb is not actually in the book, it's just a name that was given later to describe the contents of the book. So what does proverb mean? Well, there's two Latin words. Pro means instead of, verb means words. And so the idea of proverb, or the meaning of proverb, simply means you use a very short form of language instead of using a lot of words. So the idea is in just a few words, illustrative, usually sort of artistic, poetic style, you'll convey a big idea with a very few words that are also easy to remember. And you can see there that there are many applications in the book of Proverbs. Now, the book of Proverbs is not a book of law. And what I mean by that is that the book of Proverbs will contain promises and things that are general principles for life. So it doesn't mean that they're 100% as in the law, which are always unchanging in the Old Testament law, Old Testament times. Proverbs are just general principles of life. So it doesn't mean that it happens every single time, that if you're a godly person that you'll be blessed and in abundance. It just means that that's a general principle of life, that when we follow God's ways, we are blessed, material and relationships. But it doesn't mean always, because we live in a fallen world. And you can see lots of topics covered there in the second paragraph relating to family, parents, children, neighbors, work, and even our duty as citizens. In these three books, all three of them are written by King Solomon. Now let's think for a moment. We're going to just do a quick review. If you were to try to find in our books of history here, our books of history, which include Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, the books of Kings and Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now we want to go find out a little bit about the life of Solomon. Now we're not going to find it here in these books, but where can we look? So let's do a quick review. Of course, you have Joshua and Judges. Now, of course, those are kind of easy to remember. Joshua's about Joshua. Judges is about the judges, like Gideon and Deborah and Samson and so forth. And then after Joshua, Judges, we come into the first Kings, a book of 1 Kings. Now, that helps us remember, not 1 Kings, 1 Samuel. We'll get to the Kings in just a second. So 1 and 2 Samuel. So 1 Samuel, we see a transition. Samuel is born. He's going to be the final judge. And you're going to see a transition, actually, to what we're going to look at next lesson, which is the prophetic age. But Samuel, you remember, in 1 Samuel, we see the anointing of the first king, which was King Saul. So Samuel becomes the anointer of the king, the first King Saul. And so the rest of the book of 1 Samuel has to do with King Saul's reign. So if you think 1 Samuel, just think the reign of King Saul. Now David is also, all the early stories of David before he became king are also in the book of 1 Samuel. So in that book of history. So you come into 2 Samuel. Now in the 2 Samuel, the first chapter, it talks about the death of King Saul and then the beginning of the reign of King David. So the whole of the book of 2 Samuel describes the kingly reign of David. So when you think 1 Samuel, think rule of Saul. When you think 2 Samuel, think the rule of David. So we're not to Solomon yet, but we're almost there, right? So at the end of 2 Solomon, beginning of 1 Kings, we see the final days of David, King David. And of course, we see the anointing of the next king, King Solomon. And so you can see there, as it says in the third paragraph on page 73, in 1 Kings chapter 4, you start to see the early days where he asks God comes to him in a vision, asks him what he would like to have, and Solomon requests to have wisdom to rule the people. So God says since he asked for this wisdom, he would certainly give him the wisdom, but since he had not asked for fame and wealth, that God would also give him these things. So the book of Proverbs, written by King Solomon, whose lifetime took place in the book of 1 Kings. You can also see there in the fourth paragraph down on page 73 where it says there are 31 Proverbs. So, if you want to read through the book of Proverbs, You can just read one chapter every day, and in 1 month, you'll make it through the entire book. All right, now we're just going to see what the book of Proverbs has to say about a few of the topics, knowing that it covers a lot more topics, but we're just going to look at these. And I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation tonight, which is a paraphrase version. So it's a nice, modern, easy to read style. So lesson 17, book of Proverbs chapter 3, verses 13 through 15. What does Proverbs have to say about wisdom? Verse 13 says, "Joyful is the person who finds wisdom, the one who gains understanding. For wisdom is more profitable than silver, and her wages are better than gold. Wisdom is more precious than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with her." So wisdom is more valuable than any sort of commodity or precious metal. And the return that we get in our life from being wise people is far above any sort of material riches that we could have. Okay, next you'll see on page 73, it says gossip. Now that's written into your book already, but I'm going to read the passage in chapter 11, verses 13. Chapter 11, verse 13 says this: "A gossip goes around telling secrets, but those who are trustworthy can keep a confidence." So, and by the way, in families, in churches, and communities, one of the most destructive forces is gossip. And now, what is gossip? Well, the simplest definition is if you're talking about a person, especially in a negative way, and they're not in the room, you're probably gossiping together with whoever it is that you're talking to. But gossip is always destructive, and if you're not trying to help someone or you're not trying to work out the problem and you're just talking about it, that is gossip. Okay, now what about lying? Chapter 12, verses 22. What does the book of Proverbs have to say about lying? Chapter 12, verse 22 says this: "The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in those who tell the truth." Now, the older translations, or which one of them is here, and King James also, I believe, the New American Standard Bible uses the word abomination, which just means it's disgusting to him, or as it says here, the Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in those who tell the truth. Now let's go on to the next topic we're going to look at. The next one is drinking. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on drinking, but there's a principle we're going to see here, which is written into your book. I'm going to read the passage in 23:29, and I just mentioned that, as most people know, drinking is not forbidden in the Bible, but you also have to understand that in biblical times, they didn't have what we would call hard liquor or strong drinks. They had wine. And whenever the Bible refers to strong drink, it's simply referring to pure wine. So most of the time in ancient days, when people drank wine on a daily basis, it was watered down between 3 parts water to 1 part wine to 5 parts. Or I believe it's in maybe the Iliad, I believe, or in one of those stories, the ancient story that they had in the Greek times, it referred to the wine that they were drinking when they were traveling was 1 part wine to 30 parts water. So the point is this: when it talks about drinking wine in the Old Testament days, it's not talking about what we think about today, which we drink it straight. When it talks about drinking strong drink, it's simply talking about drinking wine without it being watered down. And we're not going to read it here. There was one time in the Bible where it's clearly stated that a certain kind of person is forbidden to drink wine. It says a person who is ruling over other people is absolutely forbidden to drink strong drink. But in any case, any type of drinking, this will apply. Proverbs 23, verse 29 says this. 23, 29 through 32. "He who has anguish, who has sorrow, who is always fighting, who is always complaining, who has unnecessary bruises, who has bloodshot eyes. It is the one who spends long hours in the taverns trying out new drinks. Don't gaze at the wine to see how red it is, how it sparkles in the cup, how smoothly it goes down. Then verse 32 says this, "For in the end it bites like a poisonous snake. It stings like a viper." So the point is, when it comes to drinking, like many of the things that are not healthy for us in the long run, in the moment we enjoy it for just a few moments, but there's always a destructive return. Next we see meddling. Also called being a busybody or being in other people's business. What does the Bible in the book of Proverbs have to say about meddling? Meddling chapter 26, verse 17 says this, "Interfering in someone else's argument." I didn't give you that last answer. Let me put that up there. Oh, it's already written in your book. There we go. (26:17). Interfering in someone's argument is as foolish as yanking a dog's ears. Now, what does that mean? I don't know exactly, but I think the bottom line is it's not a good idea to yank the ears of a dog or to pull the dog by the ears. That's probably going to turn out badly. And in the same way, meddling in other people's affairs, particularly in other people's problems, is not going to turn out badly. Somebody's going to get hurt, and it may be you. And then you can see there, chapter 27, verse 2, about boasting. It says, "Let someone else praise you, not your own mouth. Let a stranger praise you, not your own lips." Now that is a word or an idea that we don't see much in today's world, where it's about pomp and exaggeration and hyperbole, and this idea that a person should be humble and should be slow to praise themselves and should let other people be the ones to speak highly of them. I'm reminded of Jesus, who said, "You should be the one to sit in the back. Instead of seeking after the seats of prestige in the front of the temple or the front of the synagogue, you should sit in the back." And so that same sort of attitude is promoted in the Bible. Then we see 29:5 talking about flattery. 29:5, I'll put the suggested answer there. 29:5 says this, "To flatter friends is to lay a trap for their feet." And so the point is, whenever someone is really trying to flatter you, you need to always beware, because there's probably strings attached to that flattery. So we should not make it a habit. Now, encouragement is one thing. Encouragement is a genuine something that we're trying to build someone up, to encourage, to give them courage. Encouragement is a great thing. But flattery, which is this idea of sort of false or, very sort of superficial, bragging on someone just for some sort of effect, that is not good. But encouraging is a good thing. Now, it also mentions there, you'll see the middle of page 73, it talks about chapter 31. And chapter 31, which is the final book, has what's called, as it says here, the chapter of woman's rights, or it's called the description of a noble or virtuous woman. That's a really famous and beautiful passage. And it's also, as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, organized in a poetic acrostic. Okay, now let's look at the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes literally means preacher, as it says here. Now I'm going to begin by reading the first 11 verses, just so you can get an idea of the feeling. Remember, this is Solomon, and you'll remember the life of Solomon. He started out really good, faithful to the Lord, being blessed with wisdom, but then we see in his life, as we read through it, he started for political gain and for material gain. He started marrying all these wives. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and most of those wives were for political connections, so that he could make business deals and such. And then for compromise, to keep everyone happy, he would let these foreign wives bring in their idols, their gods, into Israel and set them up. And so we see that in his old age, it says that his heart was turned away from God. And so most of the people who read this book think that this was written in one of those times when he was seeking meaning and purpose after he'd fallen away from the Lord. This is what he writes. I'll begin in verse 2. Says the teacher, which is Solomon, "Everything is meaningless, completely meaningless. What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises, the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and then turns north, around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond description. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. Sometimes people say, here is something new, but actually it's old. Nothing is ever true. We don't remember what happened in the past, and in future generations, no one will remember what we are doing now. That is pretty bleak. And what he's doing is setting up this picture, which is going to be concluded in just a moment, as he searches for meaning in this world apart from God. But we see in verse 113, the first thing that he seeks after, that he thinks will make life worth living. What is the first thing that he seeks there in verse 13? It says this. It says, I, the teacher, was king of Israel, lived in Jerusalem, and I devoted myself to the search for understanding and to explore wisdom by everything being done under the sun. But I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. I observed everything going on under the sun, and really it is all meaningless, like chasing the wind. And then it says in verse 18, as you'll see already written in your book, what does he find that he gains from all his study and all his understanding? He actually says that his grief and his sorrow are increased. And then he goes on to seek something else we see in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. I'll read those as you have the suggested answer up here. So wisdom and search for knowledge and education, it didn't bring him contentment and peace, so he went on to something else. I said to myself, come on, let's try pleasure. Let's look for the good things in life. But I found that this too was meaningless. So I said, laughter is silly. What good does it do to seek pleasure? After much thought, I decided to cheer myself up with wine. So he tried laughter and having fun. Didn't work. Then he tried wine. And while still seeking wisdom, I clutched at foolishness. In this way, I tried to experience the only happiness most people find during their brief life in this world. But we'll see. He tried pleasure. He applied entertainment. All these different things. But then he discovers something that is listed there, written out for you in verses 10 or 11. He discovered that all these things, wealth, riches, pleasures, sexual escapades, wisdom and understanding, all these things that people dedicate their life to. He built huge gardens and buildings, and yet he found it was all meaningless because soon it would all just blow away. And you can see in the first 8 verses of chapter 3 are very famous because of a song by the Byrds, To Everything, Turn, Turn, Turn. I'm not going to try to sing that, but it just talks about that there are these different times and seasons of life. But then he goes to find that even in all of these times, these seasons, it is still meaningless, or it's still vanity. And then we see in chapter 6, he talks about how meaningless riches are. He talks about his reputation being famous. Chapter 9, he talks about whether people are good or live good lives or they live bad lives. In the end, if there is no God, there's no difference, right? You can live a wonderful, good, moral life, and you can live a vile, evil life. But if there's no God, in the end, you're both dead. It doesn't make any difference. But we do see something here that he gives an interesting promise in 12:7. He makes an interesting observation. We see this view of the afterlife, that there is more to this life than just what we see. In chapter 12, verse 7, he says this. I'll put the suggested answer up there. He says, for the dust, referring to the man who was made from the dust will return to the earth, and the spirit of the man will return to God who gave it. So we see now his transition that he begins in chapter 12 as he begins to introduce God back into the story and the thinking, and seeing that meaning comes from that. And then we see, if you want to read just the final couple of verses, matter of fact, just the final verses 13 and 14, which I'll read this. This summarizes the whole book. He said, that is the whole story. Here now is my final conclusion. Fear God and obey his commandments, for this is everyone's duty. God will judge us for everything we do including every secret thing, whether good or bad. So the conclusion of all these things, you had Solomon, who had unlimited authority, unlimited resources, unlimited opportunity to study and be educated. He was a very bright person. And yet in all those things, he found meaninglessness. He found them to be vanity. But when God is introduced, then God can give meaning to all of those things. But in themselves, none of those things can give us meaning or happiness. Fear God, keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of life. And then the bottom of page 75, just briefly as we close, the book called Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. You can see Solomon wrote 105 songs according to 1 Kings 4:32, and this book is called the Song of Songs because it's the best of songs. And we're not going to read it in this. I tried to find a passage to read, but this is a pretty explicit chapter, but it's a book, but it's in a good way because what it really celebrates, it shows that God's design for sexual experience in the covenant of marriage between one man and one woman is a beautiful thing, created God to be enjoyed and to be celebrated. And that's why it's called the Song of Songs, celebrating the love and the physical attraction and all those things that happen in God's design with God's blessing between a man and a woman in that covenant, that lifelong covenant of marriage. And so you can go read that in your own time. That is the end of our lesson 17. And next lesson, we'll be starting with the book of Isaiah. We'll begin on the new shelves talking about the prophets. Thank you.